bring you the third programme in our history series for Leaving Certificate students, entitled In Living Memory.
Peace has reigned in Ireland for the last 18 months. Our friends may feel assured that it will not be disturbed. It is true that a semi-military body was formed here over a year ago, and that under new leadership it has recently avowed that one of its aims is the overthrow of representative government. The Irish people fought for centuries to regain control of their own affairs. They have not the least intention of surrendering that control now to any dictator or to any militarist group whatever. The aims and methods of the so-called National Guard are in fact so hateful to the vast majority of the people that only the protection of the police would make it safe to wear the uniform of that body in the street. No government worthy of its trust would allow its citizens to be plunged into anarchy in order to gratify the ambitions of a few would-be dictators. The National Guard will have to choose between disappearance or conversion into a peaceful, non-military organization.
Eamon de Valera there, speaking about the Blueshirts. Two main violent organisations threatened the order of the state in the period, the Blueshirts and the IRA. The Blueshirts were a phenomenon of the 30s, but the IRA had been in existence since the Civil War. The IRA went underground after its defeat in the Civil War, and it claimed allegiance to the Republic declared in 1919. Alongside the IRA, in the early days of the decade, there were a number of other Republican and left-wing organisations agitating on a variety of issues.
Social issue became very, very acute in 1930 after the American slump, the famous American slump of that year. And all this was accompanied by new organizations in Ireland. There were the Republican workers' groups, the forerunners of the Communist Party. There were various left Republican groupings, Farmers' Defense Leagues, Anti-Imperialist League, Friends of the Soviet Union, housing organizations. All of these kind of social organizations sprang up and rather frightened the Common and Yale government under Cosgrave at the time. All this had an effect on the IRA. People who were in these social organizations joined the IRA. Almost suddenly there began to be a strong left-wing section within the IRA. And O'Donnell and Frank Ryan and George Gilmore and Mick Price and people like that drew up a program which they called Saor Éire. It was a radically social program. Today it wouldn't be considered radical, but it had such things like the nationalization of the big estates, nationalization of the banks, of the big industries, the division of the land, cooperative housing programs, particularly devised to win the small farmers and the working people in the towns.
Goaded by these gadflies, the Cosgrave government introduced repressive legislation. In October 1931, military courts were established and 12 Republican and left-wing organisations were proscribed. There were many arrests and issues of Republican papers were banned. It was against this tense background of coercion that the crucial election of 1932 took place. The IRA, under attack from the government, supported Fianna Fáil in the election campaign. Paddy Bergen was a member of the IRA at the time.
In the 1932 election and 33, all sections of the IRA were instructed to work as an election team for the Fianna Fáil party. It didn't happen after that, but it happened on those two elections. And I worked for Fianna Fáil on those two elections.
Fianna Fáil won the 1932 election and formed a government on March the 9th. One of their first acts in office was to release IRA prisoners who had been locked up by the previous administration. For the IRA, it was an occasion of celebration.
Today, Republican Dublin assembles in Munster demonstration to welcome in liberty the Republican prisoners. I and my comrade prisoners today celebrate the victory of the recent elections, and in doing so, we celebrate the downfall of the Cosgrave murder gang.
Maud Gunn McBride was at the meeting.
But Ireland has stood together in this. The IRA stood firm, and they have defeated Cosgrave and the coercionists.
The IRA were overground, but the manner in which their prisoners were released had implications for the incoming government. Pat Lindsay.
I think that probably the incoming government in 1932 made a mistake in releasing certain prisoners as a gesture at that time, because it established a sort of, at the very least, a telepathic link between government and those opposed to government, or between law and order and those opposed to law and order. But then, of course, they very quickly learned.
There was a close relationship between the IRA and Fianna Fáil in 1932. In fact, they had a common origin, for many IRA and Fianna Fáil people were comrades on the Republican side in the Civil War. The relationship was so close to be at times confusing.
The relationship with the IRA was as close as if a branch had to be formed in a certain area, Limass or Jerry Boland would go down and see the local IRA commandant. He would get the IRA volunteers together, and they would form a branch of Fianna Fáil. Very often later, when Fianna Fáil began to develop, Limass or Boland or Jim Ryan or any of these leaders of those days might go into what they thought was a Fianna Fáil meeting and discover it was an IRA meeting. And they'd have to wait until the Fianna Fáil part of the meeting began.
Michael McInerney there. In the changed atmosphere brought about in 1932 by the accession of a Republican government to power, the IRA began to flex its muscles. Thousands of new recruits flocked into the organisation. Frank Ryan, one of the leaders of the IRA, declared that as long as they'd boots and guns, there should be no free speech for traitors, meaning members of the Commonwealth Party. The IRA considered Commonwealth to be a traitorous party, as it had supported the treaty settlement with Britain, abandoned the Republic, and suppressed Republicans when it was in office. The IRA now thought the boot was on the other foot and began to disrupt meetings of Commonwealth and of the other opposition parties as well.
By the end of the 20s and coming on the 30s, the farmers' meetings were being broken up by the IRA with a nod from Fianna Fáil, of course, just the same as anybody else. And that's exactly how I got in then, because one meeting at Mallow where we had Frank McDermott, I think, before he became head of the Centre Party, down addressing the farmers at a public meeting in the town hall. And these people from the back streets, you see, came along to bust up the meeting. And I was there and I took a damn poor view of this, and there were maybe a dozen others like me. And we had to go there with just fisticuffs, pure and simple. Well, we found that they were trashable in the extreme. And the meeting concluded peaceably.
Opposition speakers were being bullied by the IRA. What could they do to defend themselves? It's at this point that a small and little-known organisation, the Army Comrades Association, began to emerge into significance. The Army Comrades Association, or ACA for short, was formed on February the 9th, 1932. It was made up of former members of the Free State Army. Its original goals were constitutional and non-controversial, to uphold the state and honour Irish volunteers who died in the Anglo-Irish struggle. In August 1932, the ACA assumed a more political character and became more closely identified with the Commonwealth Party. Colonel T.F. O'Higgins, a member of a well-known Commonwealth family, was appointed leader of the ACA. After he was appointed, he announced that his organisation would protect free speech, which was then threatened by the IRA. On a more sinister note, he said that a volunteer wing of non-army men would be added to his organisation. In the last months of 1932, the ACA provided bodyguards to defend Commonwealth Party meetings. The opposition had found its answer to the bullying tactics of the IRA. The association grew rapidly and became embroiled with the IRA in frequent fistfights and riotous behaviour, especially before the 1933 election. Paddy Bergen.
We didn't take it very seriously. We fought them and made life very uncomfortable for them, and when they'd be having meetings, we'd disrupt them and, puncture the cars and do all that sort of stuff. And there were some quite serious fights. There was some shooting in Carlow Town, particularly at the general elections. That would be the general election of 1933, I think. That would be the one. And they fired shots at us, but we were well able to fire shots back when we saw the way the thing was running.
Fianna Fáil came back into office in 1933 with an increased majority. In response, the Army Comrades Association decided to organise along military lines. The organisation decided to adopt the fascist hand salute and, more importantly, to wear blue shirts. Ernest Blythe proposed the wearing of the blue shirt at a meeting of the National Executive of the ACA. He explains how the adoption of the blue shirt came about.
The reason for adopting the blue shirts was a very simple one. At a meeting, I think, somewhere in County Meath, two groups of blue shirts were present to maintain order, as it were, and secure free speech. They didn't recognise one another and they came into collision. And the result was that you had Army Comrades, as we called them at the time. We had one group beating the other. So it was decided after that that they must wear some form of uniform so that they could distinguish one group from a particular district, could distinguish a group from another. And a vote was taken at a meeting at which I was present. Various colours were proposed. I remember Tom O'Higgins preferred a grey shirt, but anyhow the blue was the colour ultimately chosen.
The significance of the blue shirt went far beyond its colour. Fascist movements throughout Europe wore shirts of various colours. Italy had black-shirted fascists, Germany brown-shirted Nazis, and now Irish right-wingers were emulating them with their blue shirt. In July 1933, soon after the blue shirt was adopted as the uniform of the organisation, the ACA changed its name to the National Guard and elected a new leader, General Eoin O'Duffy. O'Duffy had been Commissioner of the Civic Guards under the Cosgrave government, but in February 1933 he was sacked from his job of Police Commissioner by De Valera and became, as it were, available for the leadership of the blue shirts. Why was he sacked? Tommy Mullins of Fianna Fáil.
Of course, he was disloyal, number one. He wasn't carrying out the wishes of the government. And secondly, they couldn't have a man, no matter how they might overlook that, they couldn't have a man in control of the security forces who was suspect with his links with the Fine Gael party and so on. You couldn't have a man there who was suspect on those grounds, because someday, if there were a coup d'etat or anything like that, your police chief would be against you. So therefore it was absolutely essential to have a man that they could trust and that would carry out the wishes of the government. And so they got rid of him.
Under O'Duffy's leadership, the Blue Shirt movement adopted a new programme. O'Duffy describes the organisation and its policies.
Its members are unarmed. The principal objects of the organisation are to promote the reunion of Ireland, to oppose communism and kindred societies, to uphold Christian principles, to promote and maintain social order, to lead the Irish youth in a movement of constructive national action, to set up machinery for the prevention of strikes and lockouts by harmoniously composing industrial differences, to reduce unemployment by the provision of useful and economic public work. The National Guard is strongly opposed to anything flavouring of a dictatorship or a coup d'etat, and was brought into being to assist the people in their efforts to oppose any departure from democratic and representative government. During these days, when the names of our three great leaders are on everyone's lips, I very earnestly appeal to the Irish people at home and abroad to support the National Guard in reaching the goal of Griffith, Collins and O'Higgins, an Ireland united, peaceful, prosperous, free, and honoured by our own children and by all nations.
In this speech, O'Duffy defends representative government. In other places, however, he supported the idea of a fascist dictatorship, and the programme of the National Guard called for the setting up of corporate state institutions, a fascist concept. Was the Blue Shirt movement a fascist movement? Pat Lindsay doesn't think so.
They weren't fascists. If anything, I would regard them, and I'm sure that several will criticise me for saying this, but I've said it before, that they were anti-fascist insofar as they were resenting and actively resenting one-party rule, because one-party rule was the element of fascism in those days.
Ernest Blythe.
They were interested very much in the talk that was going on at that time about the corporate state. Their ideas were vague, but they felt it had the blessing of the church and that it was advocated by the Pope, and they felt that we should do anything that could be done along the lines that inspired the corporate state.
Pat Quinlan gives a rank and file view.
No. She had no time. Did I hear anything in the Blue Shirt ranks about emulating Hitler or Mussolini? That all came from Corona himself. And rather coldly received.
The government regarded the Blue Shirts as a fascist conspiracy attempting to set up a fascist state. They banned a large Blue Shirt march planned for the lawn of Leinster House on August the 13th, 1933, and described the Blue Shirts as a military organisation planning to subvert parliamentary democracy. Whether or not O'Duffy planned a coup d'etat is unclear, but the government wasn't taking any chances. On August the 20th, the government banned the National Guard altogether. The banning of the Blue Shirts helped to solidify the opposition. The Commonwealth Party, which had formed the government from 1922 to 1932, the National Centre Party, formed in 1932, and the Blue Shirts, all came together to form a new party, Fine Gael, in September 1933. The Blue Shirts continued as a new organisation within the Fine Gael Party, called the Young Ireland Association. The Young Ireland Association was itself banned in December 1933, but the Blue Shirts reappeared under yet another new name, the League of Youth. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1933, the Blue Shirts were involved in street fighting in many parts of the country. In these battles, a number of Blue Shirts were killed. Most of the fighting, however, was not very serious. Paddy Purcell remembers fighting in Dublin.
I remember some tremendously entertaining Sunday mornings in O'Connell Street, where you had guards chasing the Blue Shirts and you had the IRA chasing somebody else, and anybody with a red tie at one stage, you could chase them as a communist. Now, you read in the morning papers, and it seemed to be, the country is on the verge of disaster. To us, the only thing you had to watch, you were running after people sometimes. You never knew who you were running after. And you were running away from people other times. The only thing you had to be extremely careful of was not to run into a baton charge.
Apart from street fighting, during political meetings, the Blue Shirts supported a rate strike held by many farmers to protest against the economic war. In the course of this anti-rates campaign, many Blue Shirts were arrested and convicted. The campaign was only moderately successful, and by the end of 1934, the Blue Shirts had passed their peak. The government brought in new legislation in February of that year prohibiting the wearing of uniforms and badges. Leading Blueshirts were behind bars, and the Fine Gael party fared badly in the local government elections in June 1934. Dissatisfaction grew within Fine Gael at O'Duffy's leadership, and in September 1934 he resigned. We asked Pat Quinlan, did he approve of O'Duffy's leadership?
I didn't, and I wasn't the only one. Because, as I say, while Duffy might be a great organiser, he hadn't enough ballast at all to be in the top job. But he had a charismatic appeal, if you know what I mean. And he was put in. Personally, I thought that Tom Higgins was the man for that job. And of course he applied the same technique to the organisation of the Blueshirts as he did to the organisation of the Guards. And to a certain extent was successful thus far. But again, he knows the tactics, you see. And when the land annuity seizures came on, he agreed to allow the Blueshirts to help resist the seizures, which was the farmer's job. And was a terrible error. It's all right if we had farmer members of the Blueshirts, leave the Blueshirts at home and go as a farmer. See? But committed officially, and I think that cost him. That was the beginning of the end.
O'Duffy's parting of ways with Fine Gael signalled the effective end of the Blueshirts. The organisation continued in existence until 1937, when it was formally dissolved, but it had run out of steam in 1935. In June 1935, O'Duffy launched a new party, the National Corporate Party, which adopted the green shirt as its uniform. All that remained of the Blueshirts was a legacy of bitterness out of all proportion to anything they achieved. The memory of the Blueshirts passed into Irish political folklore.
One time that I felt very offended was, I remember the date very well because it was the date of my confirmation. And I had a white dress for the confirmation. And then, of course, when you came back from the church, you had to get into ordinary clothes. And my mother had made us a new cotton dress so that we'd have something new to wear for the rest of the day. And this dress had a fair amount of blue in it. It had white in it, and it had red as well. It was a very lovely little dress. And we went out playing in these, and somebody passed me, "Ah, there you are now in a new dress like the Blueshirts." And I went in and took the dress off, and I never wore it again. And that was 1939.
The failure of the Blueshirts was paralleled by a decline in the fortunes of the IRA. The initial enthusiasm with which the IRA greeted Fianna Fáil's coming to power soon gave way to disillusionment among some activists. There were a number of reasons for this. Other outlets were being provided by the government for the activists' desire for military membership of an organisation. A new armed police squad, popularly called the Broy Harriers, was formed, which drew many potential recruits from the IRA. New legislation helped to win IRA members to the Fianna Fáil side. Bills were passed compensating Republicans for property losses in the Civil War. Fianna Fáil's success in dismantling the treaty settlement convinced many that at last the country was on the high road to the Republic, that the IRA was therefore obsolete. Within the IRA there was considerable dissension. Left-wing activists O'Donnell and Price were dismissed from the organisation for attempting to form the Republican Congress, a radical socialist movement. With the evaporation of the Blueshirts as an enemy in which to focus, the organisation was, by 1935, adrift. State coercion helped to further weaken the movement. Following IRA intervention in a tram and bus strike in Dublin in 1935, some IRA leaders were imprisoned by military tribunals. Issues of an Phoblacht were seized. The honeymoon relationship between Fianna Fáil and the IRA had come to an end. De Valera showed as little willingness to tolerate an illegal army as his predecessor, W.T. Cosgrave, had done. Many IRA members left the organisation. Some got out in other ways.
I didn't, as a matter of fact, decide to leave the IRA. What happened was, again, there was always this thing within the army. Sometimes you got this terrible feeling of futility. I remember one occasion when we were going to have a civil war, and it was very, very sad. It's funny, but it was very sad anyway, because we were so few. And our objective now in Carlow was to take the Curragh. I could see myself, here, and the next one would be about a mile away, and we were going to take the Curragh. It was ridiculous. And, then you get all this sort of feeling that what we're here, we're doing nothing, we're just wasting time. And though somebody would suggest that we form a party.
The IRA's ventures into politics proved as unsuccessful as their military efforts. In 1936, the IRA was declared an unlawful organisation. The Bodenstown March was banned, and the Chief of Staff of the IRA, Toomey, was sentenced to 3 years, 3 months imprisonment. At the end of 1936, some of the left-wing members of the IRA and other revolutionaries went to Spain to defend the Spanish Republic. A contingent led by O'Duffy fought on the Franco side. An attempt by the IRA to start a northern campaign in 1937 failed to get off the ground. Sean Russell, as Chief of Staff of the IRA in 1938, planned a new departure, a bombing campaign in Britain. For their part in the bombing campaign, 2 IRA members, Barnes and McCormack, were hanged. Michael McInerney was in England at the time, and here's his memory.
I remember one interesting recollection that I went to Cayley one night with this petition in my hand, going around getting signatures, and I went up to one chap who was playing the fiddle in the band, and I asked him, Paddy, would you like to sign this for me? It's for the reprieve of Barnes and McCormack. He said, stopping his fiddle for a moment, he said, sure, some men have to die for Ireland now and again. There's nothing we can do about it. And it's something that is good in its own way. And then he went on playing the fiddle as if nothing was at stake, which was rather interesting, coming from a man who, in a way,